To call The Legend of Zelda influential is a terrible understatement. It helped launch the Famicom disk system and showed what an expansive adventure game could be like on a console when it combined arcade action, puzzles, and light role-playing game mechanics. It also was very influential to me personally. I remember asking my dad to take a picture of me when I finally beat the game for the first time as a kid.
Over the years, there have been several very good games that were clearly influenced by The Legend of Zelda, and that's fine, because The Legend of Zelda itself was influenced by games such as Tower of Druaga and others. In this video series, I'm going to try and do something a little different. I'm going to go into different games that were inspired by The Legend of Zelda that you might know, and several that you might not know. I'm going to cover Neutopia, 3D Dot Game Heroes, and Willow for NES. But first, I need to talk about saving games on video game consoles in the mid-1980s. Saving your games is now taken for granted, but back then, things got a little weird. Most Americans had no idea about this because we got The Legend of Zelda on cartridge near the launch of the NES. Saving console game data in the mid-1980s. When the Nintendo Famicom was first released, it followed in the tradition of previous video game systems that had game data ROM on a cartridge that was loaded into RAM when the unit was powered on, and whatever game data was loaded into the console at the time went away when the device was powered off. However, game players were hungry for more advanced games that would deliver longer gameplay, requiring your progress to be saved and then later recalled. There were a number of methods used. Battery save systems on cartridges. When The Legend of Zelda was released in the United States, it was the first NES game to have a battery save system. That meant the cartridge had a tiny amount of SRAM memory that was kept powered on by an onboard battery, which kept the tiny amount of SRAM energized so that your save data remained on the cartridge in between your gameplay sessions. This was a bit of a hodgepodge solution to the problem of saving game data on a cartridge. Now, the Famicom boom started in 1983, however games with battery save cartridges did not start to come out until late 1986, and they would not get more popular until later in the Famicom's life. Dragon Quest III was the first Dragon Quest game to have a battery save and not a password in Japan. This extra save hardware was convenient for the end user, but it was more expensive and slightly drove up game cartridge prices. Another issue is that eventually these batteries die, and it's necessary for the onboard batteries to be replaced, either by fans or by retro game shops. The euphemism in Japan is battery service has been completed. Dedicated emulation consoles such as the Retron 5 and the Retro Freak are popular choices to download saved data off a cartridge and then reload it back onto the cartridge after a battery replacement has been done. It is amazing the effort that some people go to keep their old Pokemon save data around. Gotta catch 'em all and preserve them for future generations. Famicom Data Recorder. The Nintendo Famicom Data Recorder was an audio cassette drive which would be hooked up to the Family Basic keyboard, which would be used with the Family Basic programming cartridge, and you could save a small amount of data to cassette tapes. Some of the only games that used this were Lode Runner and Excitebike. Amusingly, the American version of Excitebike still has the save and load options that are trying to connect to the Famicom Data Recorder cassette drive, which never got a release in America. The non-functioning save and load feature on the American version of Excitebike always confounded me as a kid. One of these days, I'm gonna have to get a red and white Famicom Data Recorder to go with my Famicom. You can also use it to listen to cassette tapes. This is such an incredible mid-1980s solution. The Nintendo Famicom Disk System. When the Famicom Disk System came out in 1986, it was an attempt by Nintendo to solve several problems plaguing the early Famicom games. The Famicom Disk System RAM adapter had more RAM and actually represented a hardware upgrade over basic NROM cartridges. This would also inspire the creation of memory mapper chips, which would go on to power more advanced NES and Famicom games. The floppy disks were quite cheaper to manufacture and sell than cartridges. Nintendo was able to take more control over third-party game publishing by requiring a Famicom Disk System game to be licensed and published by them, a monopolistic move that they would continue for all of their later systems, including the American NES release. And finally, the Famicom Disk System could allow you to save your game progress to the disc. Sometimes you had to flip the disc over to save your game. One of the more amusing things about using the Famicom Disk System today is that the saved game progress of the prior owners of all the discs remain on the floppy disk for you to peruse. The Famicom Disk System wasn't perfect, but it was highly influential. It really inspired Nintendo to make cartridges with memory mappers and battery saves so that the Famicom Disk System games could be brought to America on cartridge. The original release of Legend of Zelda was only on floppy disk in Japan, but later, around 1990, they actually got a cartridge release of The Legend of Zelda, which was called The Legend of Zelda 1. Ironically, they chose a green cartridge instead of a gold cartridge which we got for Legend of Zelda 1 and 2. Metroid and Kid Icarus were also Famicom Disk System exclusives in Japan, but when we got them in America, they used cartridges with a password system. Many games, such as Castlevania, were originally released on the Famicom Disk System and were easier to get through because you could actually save your progress and play through the higher levels at a later date. By the way, if you are playing Famicom Disk System games on an EverDrive, you have to hit the reset button so that the EverDrive will save the virtual floppy disk image to the SD card to save your game. I found this out the hard way by losing a play session of Zelda 2 for Famicom Disk System when I just turned off the console without hitting reset to save the virtual disk. Passwords. Passwords were popular options because they did not require any additional hardware, but the game needed to be designed in stages so that your progress was encoded into a password that would denote the items that you had unlocked and your progress in the game. Many of these were very simply encoded, and some ingenious fans have figured out how to change the passwords or generate their own. However, passwords could be a phenomenal pain in the butt to use because you had to manually write them down and then type them in using the controller. The process was a bit tedious, and it lended itself to human error. Some games, such as Faxanadu, were notorious for having difficult-to-read fonts, and if you wrote down the wrong letter or the wrong case of a letter, it could potentially wipe out your progress in the game. Believe it or not, one of the best ways to save your passwords for original retro video game consoles is with a cell phone, by taking a clear picture of the screen and having it on your phone. Save states in emulators and EverDrives take the pain out of writing down and typing in passwords. Passwords also allow you to take your game progress between retro game platforms. I've actually started a game on a virtual TurboGrafx-16 on PlayStation 3, and then typed in the same password on a real system and emulators. For better or worse, passwords have been an integral part of playing longer games on 1980s video game consoles. Some games, such as the Rockman Mega Man sequels and Castlevania 3 Akomajo Densetsu, use graphics symbols or dots to store the progress data. Passwords remained a popular option, especially among third-party developers, because they were more of a software-based solution and didn't require the implementation of a more expensive cartridge design with a battery. Games with password saves stuck around through the 8-bit and 16-bit eras. ASCII Turbo File. The ASCII Turbo File was a small box that contained a small amount of RAM and an AA battery. It plugged into the expansion port on the Famicom, and games such as the Japanese version of River City Ransom and Wizardry could be saved to it. PC Engine TurboGrafx. When the original PC Engine was developed, they did not have any way to save game data onto the small cue card cartridges, and they kicked the can down the road by having a powerful expansion bus on the back of the PC Engine. Many game developers chose to use a password system, and some chose to support the later memory banks for saves. The Tenno Koe 2 memory bank was an external memory bank that housed some RAM and a battery and was used by several PC Engine games on HuCard. This technology was also built into the Turbo Booster Plus, the CD-ROM interface unit, and the PC Engine Duo systems. Neutopia makes good use of the PC Engine hardware by using the File Vault or password system. Luckily, my Super System Pro 3 has a built-in file cabinet, so I can save to that without having to write down passwords. Now, on to the games. Neutopia for PC Engine and TurboGrafx 16, made by Hudson in 1989 and 1990. Ah yes, Neutopia, the Legend of Zelda that we have at home for PC Engine and TurboGrafx 16 gamers. It is well made, but very, very derivative. They say that imitation is the greatest form of flattery. Well, then Hudson really must have admired the original Legend of Zelda quite a bit. It looks quite good, but artistically, it still feels very generic and a little uninspired, but it still has a really good feeling of exploration. One of the more retro things about it, that was retro even for the time, is that you can only move in 4 directions and you cannot move diagonally. This was changed in the sequel, but much like the original Legend of Zelda, you can't move diagonally. Link would also figure out how to move diagonally when the game series moved to the Game Boy and the Super Famicom. In Neutopia, you start the game very underpowered, but you quickly find better weapons and armor. When you die, you lose half of your money. That makes grinding for better stuff a little tricky at first. It's real tough if you don't grind for power-ups, but then again, so is the Legend of Zelda at first. The first boss is a bit of a bullet sponge, except you're using a sword, so I guess it's a sword sponge. There are walled-off areas, then after you defeat 2 dungeons, a door opens and you literally unlock a staircase to the underworld realms. Artistically, the one thing that Neutopia does differently is it has a lot more non-playable characters in caves that you can talk to with more dialogue than the original Legend of Zelda. Neutopia still feels like a retro throwback to earlier concepts of The Legend of Zelda, despite being made in 1989. Japanese video game development came a long way in a very short period of time in the mid-1980s. Hudson made their own unabashed version of the original Legend of Zelda without the influence of the second Zelda game. Playing this game made me appreciate Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link because they actually tried to do new things. Neutopia feels just like Hudson tried to make their own version of Legend of Zelda, but without straying too far from the original source. Say what you will about Adventure of Link, but they actually tried to do different things instead of having it feel just like an expansion pack. This game feels more like an attempt to deliver more of the original Legend of Zelda without trying to rock the boat than the actual sequel to the original Legend of Zelda. This was a deliberate decision because The Adventure of Link was already out in Japan before the PC Engine and this game was put into production. There are a couple ways to play this game. You can either track down a physical copy of the game on TurboGrafx-16. This game is also on the TurboGrafx Mini and the PC Engine Mini, and there actually was a downloadable version on the PlayStation 3 and the Virtual Console on the Wii and Wii U. I would actually suggest trying to import a PC Engine Mini because it's a lot easier to find than a TurboGrafx-16 Mini, and it has all the same games on it, including the English versions. Of all the Legend of Zelda clones, Neutopia is the one that feels the closest to the original Legend of Zelda. If you love the original game, then it's definitely worth checking out. 3D Game Heroes for PlayStation 3 by Silicon Studios and From Software, 2009 and 2010. Japanese game development house Silicon Studios is known for making game engines and middleware. They made a retro-inspired game that uses 3D voxels to bring a pixelated game character to life in a 3D space. They showed this demo to From Software, who offered to publish it if they turned it into a real game. Thus, 3D Games Heroes for PlayStation 3 came to be. It has a freaking amazing, unique graphic art style that uses voxels and shaders, and it looks like something you could expect to see on the PlayStation 5, but it's on the PlayStation 3. It looks like a 2D game was turned into a 3D game, but instead of using polygons, they use 3D pixels. The world is also realistically rendered with lighting, bokeh effects, and blurred perspectives. When enemies die, they explode in a physics engine-powered cascade of bouncing pixel cubes. In making this video, I found out the hard way that the PlayStation 3 forces digital copyright protection settings over HDMI, and the only way to get around it is to purchase an HDMI splitter and then run it into my Elgato capture device. So, I actually bought hardware just to make this video, and I'm glad I did because it looks amazing. This game looks amazing, sounds amazing, and is a heck of a lot of fun. Apparently, 3D Game Heroes sold well, but it hasn't been ported to any modern systems. It was published by From Software in Japan and Atlas in America. This game was also never available for digital download, so the only way to play this game is to get a physical PlayStation 3 copy and play it on a PlayStation 3. Luckily, my favorite local game store, Total Games, has 3 copies on sale right now in Portland, Oregon. Go get one and tell them I sent you. Silicon Studio, From Software, and Atlas are all around, but for some reason this game has never been re-released. A used copy of this game is getting up there, but it's still reasonable. I would love to see this game on the Nintendo Switch and the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox and PC. What's crazy is that this was Minecraft graphics before Minecraft was popular. You can actually design your own 3D character in voxel pixelated glory. I will never get over how the enemies explode in pixelated explosions when you stab them with your sword. The first enemies are killer bunnies. Now, instead of shooting blasts from your sword grows into ridiculous length and girth. Make your own inappropriate sword jokes. Not only is there a ton of Legend of Zelda flavor in this game, there's also a ton of Dragon Quest flavor in this game. There really is a nice populated town straight out of The Adventure of Link. There even are chickens that you get in trouble for attacking. So despite the graphics being 3D, the perspective is at the same camera angle, so it really has a two-dimensional feel despite having 3D graphics. They still look amazing, and they still look like they haven't aged because they are highly stylized with a clear artistic vision. It really feels like the original Legend of Zelda, but in 3D. That's clearly what they were going for, and it works. The dialogue is really self-aware, and they really play around with retro video game tropes. There even is a room where you meet with the developer and they break the fourth wall. It is a crying shame that this game has never been brought to any other platforms. Go get a copy as soon as you can, because I have a feeling that someday this game could really get up there in price. It really is a love letter to the mid-1980s Japanese adventure game design. It's very respectful to the Legend of Zelda. I love this game, and I need to play it from beginning to end. Willow for NES and Famicom by Capcom in 1989. So, Willow was a really awesome action fantasy movie made by George Lucas and Ron Howard. And at the time, there were no Lord of the Rings movies, and Lord of the Rings was thought to be too complicated to ever be made into a movie. I watched it a ton as a kid, and it blew my mind. If you ask me, Willow was one of the best 1980s movies out there. By the way, Warwick Davis is one of my favorite actors, and I've always loved his work. If I ran Hollywood, I would put him in every movie. I actually really love the Willow TV series that they had on Disney Plus, and it grinds my gears that they actually have the audacity to delete the show to save money on their taxes and not pay the creators. I mean, it is bullshit. As a Star Wars fan, it's a pretty bad sign. Disney was supposed to be the caretaker of Lucasfilm, and Willow is Lucasfilm. If they can delete Willow, then what's next? Now, video games based on movies are a big deal, especially in the 1980s. Capcom made a really awesome CPS-1 arcade game based on the movie Willow that was side-scrolling, had great controls, and closely followed the plot of the movie. The game is great. Unfortunately, the arcade game has never seen a home port officially. Thank God it runs in MAME and is available on emulators. Capcom also made an NES Famicom game that did not follow the plot of the movie, but instead had Willow Ufgood traveling throughout the land to rid evil. It is a top-down action role-playing game that was obviously influenced by the original Legend of Zelda. You come across villagers that will give you side quests, and you go into their houses and talk to them. Willow fights with a sword and can cast various magic spells using magic items. With a sword, he can either stab forward or swing in a circle. The swinging sword in a circle action actually predated Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. There are experience points, and being at higher levels lets you use better weapons. You can still equip swords that you are not ready for, but you'll swing them more slowly. There's no money, but you find power-up items. There's also no save battery on the cartridge, and you have a password system. You end up having to grind to earn enough experience points to take Willow to the next level to equip better equipment, but since there's no battery save, the people who heal you in town end up being a de facto hub for your adventures. This game is awesome, in part because the team at Capcom chose to almost completely ignore the movie and make their own Legend of Zelda-like game. I mean, there are a ton of references to the movie, but it's nowhere near completely constrained by the movie. Capcom wouldn't get their own chance to make their own Legend of Zelda game until they actually joined Nintendo to help make 2 Game Boy Color and a Game Boy Advance Zelda game. Capcom was partially responsible for the game studio flagship that developed Legend of Zelda: Oracle of Seasons, The Legend of Zelda: Oracle of Ages, and Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap. Willow for NES and Famicom is a surprisingly creative game. I have to wonder what Capcom would have done if they didn't have the movie license. But 1980s Japan was a weird and bold place. Capcom decided to make their own approach to Legend of Zelda instead of a remake port of their Willow arcade game. Willow for NES and Famicom is quite good, and I don't think it gets the positive attention that it deserves. Same thing with Willow the movie. Both are way better than they have any excuse to be. Shigeru Miyamoto began sketching out his ideas for The Legend of Zelda in 1984 when he was working on Super Mario Bros. When Nintendo R&D 4 switched to developing games for the upcoming Famicom Disk System, they designed an industry-changing experience that focused on exploration and adventure. Video games are not only a technical work, but they are creative works. All creative works are influenced by other creative works that came before it, so it's only natural for video games that came after The Legend of Zelda to take some inspiration from such a seminal work.
I am nowhere near done talking about this. I have at least 2 other videos on this topic in the near future, and you need to like, comment, and subscribe, and tell all your friends who are into retro video games to also subscribe so you don't miss out on them. This is 8-Bit Joystick. Stay awesome. Play retro.